Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects podcast. Super excited today to be talking a little bit about Entra ID, formerly the artist known as Azure Active Directory.
That's right.
Very excited to, as always, be joined by Mr. Nicholas Blank.
Thank you, Chris. I am excited about today's episode. Today is one of those episodes where we peer through the mists of the, really, what does all of this mean? And today's episode comes with yet more options to secure ourselves in Entra ID. And that's actually why we're really excited to welcome Darren Robinson to the show. And Darren, we are so excited to have you to help us understand the difference between a passkey and a FIDO2 token and MFA, and when my phone buzzes, is it really for me? So thank you for joining us on the show, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite. It's something I think we have chatted about a few times. It's finally great to make an appearance. A little bit about me. Yeah, I've been in IT for over 30 years, and probably the last 30 years I've been doing identity and access management. We've given it probably some cooler and better names these days than what we did in the past. Around zero-day start and zero-day stop, and giving people on LAN-based PCs access to mainframes and hooking those things up, and then NetWare to Windows for workgroups, and then domains, and then NetWare to AD migrations, and then cloud. So identity has been around for quite some time. I've done pretty much everything you could do with it in those 30 years. So it's good to still be relevant. It's good for job security because identity is the platform of everything. I've seen many of my friends that were maybe messaging experts have gone on to other things because messaging is a commodity. It's just a SaaS thing that email's just email, and sometimes it's just fancy email. Identity, it's me. So it's good to talk about a topic that's actually the core of identity today. So, we're talking about, Entra ID, the directory service, but how you prove who you are, how you authenticate. And I think we'll probably get into some authorization components too. So I'm excited for today.
I love that, Chris. And I love that Darren is a dinosaur like us. And when we had Michael van Horenbeek on the show, and he made this lovely remark that said, no one understands what Active Directory is anymore. And when you need someone to understand that, you bring out the dinosaurs. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Yes, it's become a bit of an inside joke now, the sort of dinosaurs and dealing with Active Directory. But, it's still there, right? It's still hanging on for dear life. So, yeah, it's not going anywhere. And interestingly, and I think this is kind of, to kick us off here, right? I think something that interests me or that fascinates me is we're seeing I guess continued evolution within the way that we authenticate and prove who we are within Entra today, right? Historically we've just had usernames, passwords, and then along came this MFA thing that I think has been adopted in different ways by different orgs, right? And I was remarking earlier that I still come across organizations. I do a lot of N365 and Azure type assessments, security assessments, to help customers figure out where exactly they are in terms of their journey with securing themselves and their data and their organization. And I still come across a lot of organizations that just don't have any form of MFA, right? So not just, I think we'd all love to believe that everyone has MFA enabled for everyone, at least, right? And maybe there's some different levels of MFA for administrative accounts. But the reality is there's still a lot of orgs out there that they haven't even deployed it yet because for whatever reason, it's either a perceived cost issue, because I think really if there's a cost issue, it's definitely perceived, not real. But more an inconvenience issue or a legacy platform issue or what have you, right?
Yeah, usually it's user friction, user disruption when they're just trying to get on and do their job.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that's
also the reason why we need it, right? The reason we need it is because username and password is not enough anymore. It's like and people are lazy and they do silly things like use their same password for their same account in multiple different places because of the way that we've built up authentication systems for 50 years.
No, that's accurate, right? And I think that I've seen some interesting frictiony areas, right, with customers where, for example, they and this is, I think, quite prominent in Europe and in the US as well, where we can't rely on the end user to use their personal mobile device as an MFA option, right? Because we haven't provided them that device as an organization, so we now can't expect them to use their personal device for MFA, and so that brings about some challenges. But one of the things I think that I wanted to kind of, I guess, get straight into here is we've seen a lot of talk about things like passkeys, right? Obviously, the passkey push has been going on for a little while now, and I think probably on the consumer side, like Google has been very strong with forcing people. How I looked at my Google account the other day and I had like 5 passkeys in there that I don't even remember creating, right? Because they've been made it that easy for folks, I guess, to enable this thing. But it's kind of scary too, because you don't always understand what exactly you're doing with that and how this all works, right? And so the first question I kind of wanted to ask you was, with passkeys and Entra, I mean, where are we at with that? Specifically thinking about it from an organization and a business perspective.
Well, from a feature perspective, it's in preview with Entra ID today. So passkeys is something that Microsoft's been talking about, being on that journey for quite some time. We expected to have seen it already, but when the reality comes of enabling passkeys for the enterprise, for your corporate environment, there's certain restrictions that you want to have as an enterprise to know that the passkeys are going to be used in the right way, so that the person that's using the passkey is the person that it was generated for on a device there's a level of trust and assurance with. So while passkeys are becoming a bit more common for any modern website where you sign up for a service and you're not creating a username and password anymore, you sign up, you're creating a passkey or using passkey as an MFA method. That's on the consumer side, and that's rooted in a different level of trust system that you want in an enterprise. So if you break it back just one level further, you've got 2 types of passkeys. You've got device-bound passkeys and you've got syncable passkeys. Syncable passkeys is what you see from Google and Apple with their iChain and Google with their Google Password Manager, because they can sync between all your devices in those ecosystems, either Android or iOS. So if you enroll a passkey in a browser or on a device, and then syncs to all your other devices, and you can use it to log in from all those other devices via the password manager in those operating systems. They were closed systems. So you couldn't create a passkey in the Apple world and use it in a Google world. You couldn't create one in the Google world and use it in an Apple world. They were syncable within their ecosystems.
Right.
So they also restricted in iOS and Android, where they could sync to, which is great. Basically, they were locking you into passkeys in their ecosystem. As an enterprise, you don't control what devices people have. You want to give them choice. You don't want to say you've got to use Apple or you've got to use Android or Google. And obviously, there's not a Microsoft mobile platform anymore that would even confuse it further. So that's why passkeys have been a little bit faster to adopt on the consumer side, still coming on the enterprise side, because there was those features of allowing Google and Apple to open up passkeys to other, basically, let's call them wallets, to store the passkeys in, wasn't available until iOS 17 recently. The last versions of iOS 17 before we hit 18, which was the beginning of this month, and Android with 14. So it's only then, it's taken like lobbying for probably a couple of years from Microsoft to allow Apple and Google to both open up so you could use a different wallet to store the passkeys, and then bringing in the other features of the open standard of what passkeys is, because it's open standard. It's not something that Microsoft's created. It's something that the FIDO Alliance has created in conjunction with those manufacturers to provide the interoperability and to pass on the signals of when someone is using it. So we've gone really technical really quick there, but really the key point is Apple and Google were pretty much closed shop in those ecosystems. You use passkeys within those ecosystems, consumer side, not enterprise. Now, with them opening that up, you can now use other things like the Microsoft Authenticator to store a passkey on either device as part of that, getting a passkey, getting it into a mobile device and using it. So,
okay. And so that presumably that also then, sorry, Nick, that also then allows access to third-party password managers, for example, then if you're using Bitwarden or whatever other flavor of password manager.
Yes, so it does, but it also, whilst that motion sensitive lights, while it does allow that, then on the enterprise side, you still then want to restrict what wallet that you're going to accept for that passkey. So like 1Password has passkey support. I think Dashlane has passkey support. I'm not sure about some of the others. I'm not as intimate with them as I am with like 1Password. So yeah, you now got that option as well. So what you get is a prompt on your mobile device when you're going to save a key. Where do you want to put it? And so that's where on the enterprise side, we as enterprise administrators setting policy, we say, okay, we're only going to trust the Microsoft Authenticator wallet. And so that's when we talk about syncable in the Apple world, syncable in the Google world, we're talking device-bound passkeys now. So that's whereby you can set a policy and say, I'm going to support two types of, for this kind of sake, passkeys. One which was like Windows Hello for Business, which is essentially is a passkey, but it's on a device, a physical device rooted in the TPM chip on the device, or Microsoft Authenticator, which is on your mobile. And that's the one you allow. You can allow other ones potentially in the future, but for right now, as the preview stands, it's only the Microsoft Authenticator as a wallet to hold the passkey. And then you can control around who can create a passkey and other controls around that as well. So that's where you have the flexibility as administrator to control how they're used in your environment. And so you've got the assurance and trust of knowing it's used in the right way. But I think probably the important thing is come back to what is a passkey and why do we need it to start with? And I think I pointed to this earlier, it's like people are lazy. They reuse passwords, they reuse their logins. In an enterprise, there's different environments that you normally have access to. You might have multiple Entra ID tenants, formerly Azure AD, and you might have the same different UPNs in them, but quite often you'll have the same password. So if one of those environments had a compromise or there was a leak of credentials out of that, or anywhere else you'd used the same password before, now that's password spray attacks and brute force attacks using those common passwords and those sorts of things. And that's really bad. What passkeys are is locking you with a specific credential for one identity provider with a named account. So if my name is Darren at organization name and it's Microsoft 365 services for Office, or it's Entra ID for other bits and pieces, whatever that looks like, I've got a unique credential for that service for my name. And that's it. I can't reuse that on any other site. It's locked to that. So it's like giving you what you would previously do with a password manager. If you're an IT person and savvy, you would have a unique login with a very long password for every service. You might have the same login name, but you'd have a different password for everyone. That's effectively what a passkey is, except it's also binding you to only to be able to use it with that one service where you've registered that passkey for. And that's what they're good. It takes the laziness out of the person by putting security controls around a construct of a passkey, and that gives us what we've been asking users to do forever: use a different password for every service.
Can we stay on that point for a second? And for the administrator who wants to make a choice for their tenant, can we do a quick comparison between a username and password with a complex password with a complex MFA method, I'm going to call it, right? So either a biometric method or even a non-phishable MFA method like a FIDO2 key. Why does that administrator want to or need to go to passkeys, and effectively, what is the difference for them in terms of their security experience?
Well, at the moment, as it stands, you don't have the opportunity to go all in on, just say, passkeys rather than username passwords and a second factor. what you've got is you've got flexibility in all the different authentication methods you can use, which is what we sort of talked about parts. That seems to ever be expanding, but we've still got username and passwords. And that's because usernames and passwords are the root of every part of authentication that we've had since the mainframe on how to prove who you are in order to the login system. So to unravel a bunch of that and use other methods as primary authentication is taking some time. And even whilst you can do primary authentication to your Windows machine using Windows Hello for Business, or in a browser to Office 365 using a passkey or single sign-on link to that, there's still certain services where you've still got to fall back to a username and password. So your username and password is still there for some services. The move is to move people away from that for the primary authentication, or use a passkey as a high-level assurance for MFA. So even if you have a weak password and a username, then that's basically sort of saying, well, I think it's this person. They've got the right username, they've got a right password. Now I want a high level of assurance. I can use a passkey, which is a very, very high level of assurance because it's issued to that person. It's in a trusted store that we know. It can only be used against this site. We can't reuse credentials across multiple other sites. So it's a really good form of MFA. So that's where passkeys as device bound are really good, because if the first bit is valid or maybe valid, the second one, if it's valid, then you've got a high assurance. If you log in with a passkey, you know it was only issued to that person. You don't have to do the MFA at that point, because you've got a very high assurance on that primary authentication method that the credential that was issued to that person, it's stored in a trusted device to access that service. It's that person. Yeah, the difference is here where we talked about, maybe we hinted at like verifiable credentials before. There's still no token binding. There's no biometric token binding to it. So you're relying on the person to be able to access the wallet on the device, whether it's a phone, well, in this case, it's usually a phone if we're using passkeys in this mechanism. We're talking about FIDO2 physical tokens in a minute. But you still need to authenticate to your authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, which requires a biometric. So those controls are in there. But again, you still don't know who's registered a biometric on this device. If this isn't a corporate owned device, this is a personally owned device that's got it, which is coming back to your comment, Chris, around organizations that if you're not issued the device, you know, it's a personal device, why am I using it for work purposes? That's the people part of it. But at least there's a level of two things. It's like there is a bit of a biometric, you don't have control over it, and then it is issued for authentication to that site. It's come from that device, the person it was issued to. So it's a high level of assurance. It's not perfect. Verifiable credentials give you the benefit of being able to, again, have the same wallet authenticator, similar to a passkey. It's a credential, but it also has claims in it. It can be used for authorization, but you can also do biometric token binding. So when you issue a VC, you can take an image of the person's face. You can record it as part of the VC. When they present it, if you've got to do a high level of assurance, they're making financial transactions, they're doing something as an administrative control, as something secure, take another facial check as part of presentation, compare it, then you've got biometric token binding to the credential, high level of assurance, and then you can accept that and know that it's the person it was issued to is presenting it. So
I like that your language is rather succinct in terms of saying it's high levels of assurance versus assurance as an absolute.
Well, there's nothing that's really an absolute in IT, right? So this is where we're moving towards. I think, have you heard of, maybe you can probably better summarize it than I can, the AAL levels of like 1 through to 3, the assurance level constructs around what constitutes what level of assurance based on what credentials used and how that's used in terms of authentication and MFA. These are certain standards or certain guidelines that organizations are trying to move towards. And AAL3 is sort of the top level of that. And Microsoft isn't even committing at this stage to say they're phish-resistant mechanisms other than if it's on a trusted managed device, say Intune, company issued, all those sorts of things, and you're using these phish-resistant credentials, then in certain workflows, then they say that is AAL3. So that's where you need to be, like for FIPS compliance, for government, FIPS 140, those sorts of things. That's where you sort of need to be. But then, we don't live in a perfect world where all organizations have the same IT infrastructure, the same security controls. They're not all issuing company-issued devices that meet a certain level, that are maintained and patched and all those things, where everyone can do. But if you're military, government, those sorts of things, then you are. But that's also, and you also want that level of assurance for what you have access to and what you're doing.
Just for the sake of our listeners, just to take everyone through what we're talking about the 3 assurance levels, and that's AIL. And what we've been talking about is AIL 3, which is high assurance. And that's for a high-risk environment where we've got highly sensitive data and we need very strong identity verification. So that's normally multi-factor with rigorous verification of identity documents or cryptographic authentication, which is what we're talking about from a passkey point of view. AIL2 is moderate assurance, and that is 2-factor authentication. So password with a second factor, like a authenticator. And AIL1 is your grandfather's authentication method, which is single factor, username and password. And that's just authentication. And Darren, if you don't mind, I'd like to impose on you for another explanation, just to set the scene for our listeners and for our viewers. Active Directory does this rather transparently for folks. And those of us who have grown up with Active Directory, we are used to transparent authentication and authorization in one step. In cloud, we see this distinct separation of the two, where we talk about the two as 2 very distinct events. Do you mind just explaining that for our listeners?
So the first part of authentication is who you are. So it's just proving that you've got a set of credentials that are correct for the system you're accessing, and proving you are. So I'm Darren Robinson. I'm logging into the system. I've got a valid credential pair, whether it's password or something else. That's authentication. Authorization is then what you have access to, what you can do as a person with an account in that system. And so that's usually in a Microsoft world, you get that through group memberships. If you're a member of this group, you get to do these things. If you're a member of this group, you get to do these things. If you're in Entra ID and you're part of these roles, and you're a member of those and you're active in those roles, then you get to do those things. So that's authorization. In different ways, in different systems, they can work in different ways, where on login, all your capabilities or all your permissions, your authorizations are all contained as part of a information as part of that session and is passed along. And in other systems, it's calculated at time of access. I'm doing this thing, check to see whether or not I'm allowed to do that based on my roles, responsibilities, memberships, those sorts of things. And that's effectively how that's done. And we're in a constant change around how do we constantly ensure that someone's authenticated. They may have a long-standing session that may go for like weeks because they're continually active. That, I had these authorizations when I logged in and did my initial request. Some of them have been removed. How do we ensure that I can't do some of those things that I was authenticated with 2 weeks ago? And that's where continual access enumeration comes in within the Entra ID world, where for Microsoft services and now some others expanding, when you go to access the service, it says, I'll just check to see whether you can still do that and see whether or not you've been revoked that access. And then that's doing a check prior to you actually letting you do the thing. So that's something to get us around some of the ways that LAN Manager worked and OS2 worked sort of like 25, 30 years ago. It's been inherent in the system all the way through. And now we're trying to pull a little bit back and have an environment where you don't have to log out and get your permissions each time. You log in, you get a set of permissions, you can do whatever. You could add more permissions, still don't have to log out and log back in again. And then when they're removed instantly and you lose access to that thing.
Without going down the rabbit hole of access tokens versus refresh tokens, effectively what you're saying is the implementation of one of the primary principles of Zero Trust, which is continuous verification. can you do what you think you are able to do? And is the system aware of that? And can we just check on a regular basis so that we don't have to trust that if you've been in domain admins or global admins yesterday, that you're still a domain admin today and you don't necessarily need that level of permission. So this is a much more modern way, or the currently modern way of dealing with access rights and the expiration of access rights, because we don't want to have to trust someone or anyone for a long period of time anymore.
That's right. And you're also trying to protect yourself from other threat vectors as well. Things like token theft and access tokens and things like that that have a level of permissions with them, and then having them reused and replayed. So even if I log in and part of my method to authenticate and authorize, there's someone in the middle that's, I've gone in through a front end that looks like my front end, but someone's set up something that looks very much the same, and I've missed it, and I've logged in. They've then got my token, and then they can use it to do things that I wasn't going to do with it, but I have the permissions to do. So the new mechanism is the resource. Every time you go to do something, is checking to see whether or not the person that's associated with it is allowed to do that. So that's when then the backend systems also need to check this person's logged in from somewhere they don't normally log in or whatever. They become a high risk. Enforce MFA and make sure the access token is not valid if they can't perform that MFA or whatever. So there's multiple avenues trying to protect identities from things like, passwords initially and moving to phish-resistant credentials, then to having access tokens and extended access for extended periods of time to try and lock that down as well.
And I would say, I guess, then this is also where something like privileged access management comes into play, right? With higher privileged accounts, where you want to be able to say, well, look, the normal state of this account is it doesn't actually have any roles, and we're only going to elevate for the time the duration of the task that we need to perform. So that further protects, right? If we're evaluating constantly, but we're also only allowing elevation for that particular role at the point in time that you need it.
So when you're doing security things, you're also doing two things. One is like, what do you do on every day as part of your just general being a person in an organization doing collaborative type work?
Right.
So email, Word, Teams, whatever, that sorts of things. And then what do you do on a sometimes basis, which is privileged access that allows you to create new users or add additional permissions to users and those sorts of things. And sort of what's considered BAU versus what's considered highly permissioned things. And we do account separation on that. So you can't do highly permissioned activities using your standard everyday collaborative user account. You have a separate account to do those privileged activities, but at the same time, there's no standing privileged access on those. So you have an account that can do privileged activities, but you need to elevate the ability to do that once you actually log in with that account, and you get it for a temporal period of time. So you say, using permissions management, so I need to be enterprise admin or global admin to do these three things, which I've got an open ticket for to do the thing, and then you relinquish those capabilities. If the account is then compromised at any point, they've still got that extra step up to get those privileges again. They don't have the ability to use them straight away just by owning the account.
Yeah, and I think important thing you mentioned there as well is the separation, right? So you don't also have a mailbox and internet access and all that stuff on your privileged account that you would have on your regular user account. So
yeah, I'm sure all of us at some point in time, probably about 15 years ago, inadvertently logged in with the wrong account onto a domain controller, and then all of a sudden had group policy trying to deploy Office or something to it.
That's right. Exactly right.
Maybe a bit more than 15 years ago. Yeah. I never do it once.
It's true.
Yeah, very, very, very much. So I think we've covered some really interesting concepts here, right? And I think what's great about a lot of these is they sort of scale. So from sort of, let's call it more immature or more basic in your the deployment of these things to, super advanced and super mature as far as your operational things go. But if you're talking, if we have folks listening who are just, they work for an organization and they want to just get to that next step. So, maybe they're at the point now where they've got MFA enabled for admin accounts. Maybe not every single user has MFA just yet, but at least admin accounts are MFA'd, right? So they've sort of got that first foot up, first step up. Where's the next logical sort of step for them? Is it straight into Passkeys, or do we still look at this and go, it's a maturity model, so start doing the basics, the early basics right first before you start adopting all this new stuff?
It's definitely you've got to do it. There's no perfect time not to start it. So usually the reluctance to start it is because we've got too many edge cases, or we've got these group of people that can't take mobile phones into these locations, or in this location there's no internet connectivity, or there's whatever. So you need to do something, and you need to do something for the majority of your users as soon as you can, because do the majority first, work on the edge cases. With the good thing with Entra ID and authentication policies and MFA is you can scope them to certain sets of users, and you can put some really fine-grained controls around who and where. So definitely start there. Start with Windows Hello for Business. That's a gimme to start with, because the users will love that, to log in with their face or their fingerprint onto their device, not a username, password, and then have single sign-on to the majority of their services anyway. And that's a higher level of assurance straight off the bat. MFA for other things, Microsoft Authenticator is my recommendation, because that's really is the bootstrapping of everything else in the Microsoft ecosystem. So as much as you would like to maybe want to use some other password manager or some other wallet or anything else, the reality is this is a business, this is an enterprise, and we need some controls and everything else around that. And we need to be able to be succinct with user communications and process, and the service desk to support it and everything else. So Microsoft Authenticator on the mobile devices is the lowest entry barrier to get over. And then even if it's starting with push notifications for MFA, or typing in the 2-digit code, all those are all fine. There's levels of perfection and high levels of assurance, as we talked about, as you go further up. I think that is probably the most pragmatic way to start, and then start edging out into your other edge cases. Like, okay, no mobile devices. I need a physical FIDO2 token. The only difference between a physical FIDO2 token and a mobile one is just the number that you can actually store on a physical token. The concept is still the same. So it's still it's a very specific credential for a service with your name. And then it's either a biometric or a 4 to 6 digit PIN for that, and you're in. So there's issues with that, in that you can lose them, and if you've lost them, then you don't have your MFA method. So then it's like, do you issue two? Is that a cost prohibitive thing? Yes, but also being owned and compromised and having to recover from that is more of an issue, because you're also having to report that, and more often than not these days, or it becomes a news article, and the cost of cleanup and everything else was something that was maybe a little bit of friction to get people to adopt it from your end users, versus having your share price be affected, and your position in the market and losing face and that sort of stuff, as well as having to advise your customers that you've been in this position and in your annual report. So that's my recommendation. In terms of where I think Microsoft are going with this, they've been on this passwordless journey, phish-resistant credentials for, I remember when Alex Simons actually launched it in a keynote at, I think it was Cloud Identity Summit, that then became Identityverse after that, probably about 2017 in Chicago, I think it was. And he said, we're going passwordless. By the end of 3 years, we want X number of people logging in without a password and everything else. And they achieved that. They're still on the journey to get there. Primary authentication methods will start to move away. So you're not seeing a username password box when you log in. You'll see other methods, whether it's Windows Hello for Business, whether it's a passkey, whether it's a verifiable credential as a primary authentication methods. They're all coming. And then we can start to move away from those passwords. Passwords will still exist in the background, but the likelihood of you using them is going to go down. And then that will get people in the mindset. So even your mum and dad, I mean, I've got my wife onto a password manager. She's not IT savvy. She now uses one password for everything. She's got a different password for everything. And she is actually getting her friends onto it finally now, because a few of her friends have had identity theft. Other things happening where people trying to doing password reset flows on your Facebook, on your other things. She now understands what some of that means and why it's important to have a different username password or different password for every system, but ideally passwordless.
I think that's an important point you make, though, as well, right? Because I think very often the very first sort of reaction to something like a FIDO2 token is our users are never going to be able to use this. And I don't think that that's always true, because I feel like even in your personal private life these days, folks are becoming more familiar with these things, right? It is a slow process, and you are going to have to put out some level of communication and training and whatnot. But don't write off the user completely and just go, oh, they're never going to be able to use this, right? I mean, some of them may not be able to make that or grasp it, or it will be more difficult for them. But there are going to be those users who are just going to go, oh yeah, this is very similar to this thing I use, or and they're actually going to go. So I think our user population is, they're a little bit behind, but they're coming along on the journey, but whether we want them to or not. So we shouldn't discount them. Just
thinking back to when I was converting enterprises to use MFA. This is pre-COVID, so this is probably going back like 6 years ago or whatever. It was like the education thing was the big thing up front. It was like, this is coming. The way you log in is going to change a little bit, and this is why. But also take this opportunity to do the same thing for your private accounts. That's right. For, Facebook or your online shopping or other bits and pieces. Because this is why it's important. And I think this is also where I hammered it home with my wife the other day. I said, oh, my GovID account's been locked. And she goes, what do you mean it's been locked? There's been too many incorrect password attempts. And I said, and it's not just someone trying to pretend to be me, because you can actually go into ID.gov. This is an Australian system for the government for your sovereign services. Medicare and those sorts of things. You can go in and look at the account activity, and you can see that I've, as an identity professional, my accounts have been in data breaches like 27 times that we know about. So people are just taking my private email address and the password that's been in those compromises, and then using them against high value services like ID.gov, and you can see they only try once, because that's the credential pair they've got. They got my username and a password from a service. They try it against like Facebook. They try it against ID.gov. They try it against other things. And if it fails, they just move on to the next credential. They move on to the next credential to find someone that's reused their credential. And then they're in, and then they're halfway to owning that person's identity. But I went through the timeline. So, okay, there was an attempt in April, one in June, August, 3 in September, and then all of a sudden it triggered the thing. There's been 9 incorrect password attempts on my account, so they lock the account. I log in with my username, password, do the MFA, and then unlock my account, and then I change my password on that account anyway, back to another 42 complex character password that was in my password manager. I can see the last time I changed it in my password manager. It's the only one that uses that password. So showing that that's what happens to leaked credentials from compromised sites. That's a pretty powerful lesson to teaching people how their identities get owned and why it's important.
And it should also be a lesson to developers who are building these systems, right? Because nothing is more frustrating than me going to a site to try and registering a new login, generating a password in my password manager for them to come back and go, well, it has to be between 5 and 16 characters, and you can't use this and that. I'm like, I don't even know what this password is. It's 22 or 26 characters long. Like, why shouldn't you 42 characters? Why don't you accept that? What's the problem, right? And I think we need the rest of the world to catch up on some of these development practices. But it's interesting you were saying, like the primary login factor is going to change, and what we're going to see, I think, in enterprises specifically is legacy apps, right? Those crusty apps that are left over that were written way back when, and no one can actually maintain them.
Kerberos and NTLM.
Right.
An integrated auth.
We did a really interesting episode with Camila on how SASE and some of the sort of other Microsoft technologies can kind of help bridge that gap. But it's just a bridge. It's not solving the problem, right? You still got to keep those systems up to date. And I think
Chris, I've got super large customers.
And designers get the opportunity to change where your primary auth is going to as well.
Yeah.
And if that's now the cloud, and then you still have access to your legacy resources with legacy protocols through other mechanisms which still enforce MFA, then you're still in a much better position than you are today.
From the outside in, I would agree with you. I've got customers who have a large proportion of systems written in the last few years towards authenticating with LDAP and LDAP-S. So now consider that there's a financial system for something attached to that, and you want to modernize authentication on that system will never see the cloud, that user will never see the cloud. However, we are only one intrusion attempt away from a actor planting something that knows how to brute force LDAP, because it's really simple, right? It's just hammer away at a realm that we know that we're in, and get a UPN and get a password and try another password. Modernizing that is not easy, and customers are stuck with stuff. We had a recording that we did the session before this one where we talked about IoT, actually 2 sessions ago, and the security in IoT is still security through obscurity. And it's great that we're saying what we're saying about modern cloud-based systems, and that we can escalate authentication from MFA to FIDO2 as a non-phishable mechanism, and then over to passkeys, and there's a user education that goes along with that. But enterprises are stuck in the 80s on some of the enterprise apps. And what do we tell them?
We tell them to enable MFA for them.
There is no MFA on top of LDAP inside the network, unless you go to the expense of an authentication proxy.
Yes. So where I was being a little bit facetious there, but yes. So we do have customers that we're doing this for as well. So the same problem. You've still got host-based systems. You've got maybe terminal-based systems on premise, maybe LDAP, maybe Kerberos, NTLM, those sorts of things. But you want to have MFA for those because it's there's nothing you can do from the application perspective. You need to put effectively a shim around it that checks to see if you what the policy is for that application and whether or not MFA is required, and if it is, to enforce the same MFA that you would have if it was a cloud resource connected directly to Entra ID or federated from some other cloud or service. So the one that's probably the most prominent in this region, I'm not too sure about South Africa, Nick, but Silverfort, that's what they do. So and then the extension is basically conditional access policies in Entra ID, which then you tune to what you want to do, what you want to happen for policy to be met. And MFA is obviously the easy one there, but many other controls as well. But that's the level you can go to. Then the SSE pieces as well with Entra private access. That's where that's coming. Obviously, that's still very early days. That's still very preview, early GA, but that's the same avenue. That's the same way that's going to. That does require a client on the device, though. So with Microsoft Entra Private Access, you need the GSA client on the device. With Silverfort as the wrapper, you need nothing on the device. Yeah. It's effectively a wrapper around the directory with the authentication and accessing the service, and then doing a redirect, checking policy, triggering MFA or not, coming back, and then letting you have access.
They do a really good job. Hey, I have a customer that they recently deployed Silverfort for all their AD based stuff, and I've been using it a fair bit. They do a really good job. So it's a good one, because it's been a gap for a long time, right? Everyone's securing Entra, but what about AD and all of the stuff that still relies on AD? So.
Yeah. So there's basically two approaches. Like, do you control the devices accessing it? Yes. Well, GSA is probably your route. If you don't, And maybe if you've got outward-facing customer or consumer type pieces that are still attached to AD, that's the avenue you got to look at.
I wanted to say, in our part of the world, we see a fair amount of different mix of vendors. So we have customers trying to do this with AAD P2 or Entra ID P2, where they have some kind of an auth proxy that's pointing to the outside if there's an outside-in method that works. Otherwise, on the inside, we see a bit of ping, we see a bit of Silverfort. We've had a lot of success with a one identity where we have glued together cloud-based services as well as on-premises identities and have single username, password, or single identity with a high factor. And that's all going towards the assurance level 3 example that we spoke about. And what's great for customers is that there's a fairly wide and robust set of vendors to choose from in this. And it basically all boils down to, are you more comfortable with a Duo or a Ping or a Silverfort or a OneLogin or a Thales? Because a lot of them do similar things, but they do them in different ways. And what's important there is to choose a vendor that's tied to your requirement and how you need to do things and what that supports. And Darren, you spoke about things like, can we support legacy protocols like LDAP and RDP and other things that are still knocking about on our network, and good old fashioned radius? Wouldn't it be nice if we could do radius with a second factor, right? And you're right. We've got customers with mainframes. We've got customers with really, really old things that can't go away.
Yep, but those old things are still there because they run the business.
That's right.
That's right. Yeah.
And as much as everyone's probably tried to upgrade them or uplift them, there's a certain point where, it is what it is until, we can either find the money or find a solution that's better than what we've got. And this time and place and where we're at in the world, everyone is watching their pennies. And sometimes it's like, well, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But at the same time, it will break if you get compromised. So you've got to do some level and maybe not be perfect, but sometimes tactical solutions are still the right solution.
And I think that you made this point. You've made it twice now on this episode, right? Is don't do nothing because of one or two edge cases, right? You're better off moving the ball, moving the chain just a little bit for where you can, because otherwise, if you get into this analysis paralysis of like, well, we can't do, we have to hold back 90% of the org because of the 5% that are doing this one thing. Like, it's not worth it.
You just
forward where
reduce
you
your
can.
exposure, right? That's effectively what you're doing. You're trying to reduce your exposure and reduce your risk. So,
Chris, you've made that point a couple of times over different episodes, that you rather increment and do something, move in a direction, even if it's a tiny move. And I want to have the opportunity to ask both of you a last parting question. And it's based on my experience of what I'm seeing. For a few years, I've been talking about Active Directory as in this year's case, a 25-year-old attack platform that's super well understood by the various nefarious actors that are out there. And we're seeing from physical access to breach in minutes, sometimes seconds, because our actors are fairly well rehearsed. And once they find a thread to pull on, they pull on it really hard and get to domain admins in minutes. However, that being said, we as a business went from doing a lot of Active Directory work a while ago to the last few years doing very little, to all of a sudden, it's a massive resurgence of Active Directory. And Active Directory is back. It's loud and proud. And it's like that VW minibus of the 70s, but, with new colors and a fresh suspension, but it's back. So what are you guys seeing?
I'll let Darren go first. I'm shocked that you made a car analogy, but we'll forgive that for a second. But I'll let Darren answer first.
I'd say the same thing. It probably started around in the circles and what I do. I started seeing that probably I want to say probably about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and by that I mean organizations that hadn't really hardened their Active Directory. They hadn't really thought about it as something they needed to be more secure with, because they either hadn't started their cloud journey, or they hadn't really thought about what it meant when they did start their cloud journey. And then when they did, it's like, okay, so we're now connecting our Active Directory up to the cloud, we're synchronizing our users, those sorts of things. But the avenues for compromise are expanding, and then the heart of your system is still Active Directory. That's still your source of authority, where it doesn't matter where identity comes in from to get there, but once it's there, it synchronizes up. That's where you do your administration. And they hadn't gone and done like your tier 0, securing the core services of Active Directory, your domain controllers, your AD Connect, your PKI, and those sorts of things. So they needed to then do that. Microsoft actually had a pretty big push in this region, and I'm talking like Asia, APAC, to assist financial services institutions that didn't have the knowledge maybe themselves to do that, like tier 0, to get like a minimum level of something, but then relied on partners and solution integrators to do like finishing maybe some of that off, or going to do tier 1 for your core line of business applications, your antivirus, your backup, email, some of those sorts of things. We did a lot of that work in a lot of financial services, a lot of industry, utilities, resources to do that, to help protect them. But they're not small projects, and they're things like doing privileged access workstations to do administrative access to Active Directory. The old model was physical privileged access workstations. The new one, in a hybrid world, we also want that capability for your tier 0 in cloud to be virtual. Do you just spin up a virtual POR, do your thing, tear it down so there's no way that it can get compromised, as long as you've got secure processes to spawn a new one. We've seen a lot of that. I'd say it's tailing off a little bit. I think some of that's been cracked, but then also I'm working on some different things with some different customers these days. So maybe I've just left part of that world behind. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, look, I definitely hear what you're saying, and I agree. I think also what we saw especially with COVID, was everyone very quickly had to go and adopt cloud, right? To cloud productivity tools so that they could stay productive. And they secured those, in most instances, they secured them as they could, MFA, all of the rest of it. But I think they've really quickly realized over the last couple of years that AD, as Nick calls it, this 25-year attack surface is wide open. And so, some of the customers that I've worked with over the last little while that have had compromises, it's AD that's been compromised. It's not Azure or Azure AD or Entra. Like the compromises have happened on the AD side. So I think there's this sort of refocus here of like, what do we do with this thing? Are we going to get rid of it finally, or are we actually going to spend the time to like harden this thing now so that it because it's going to stick around for a little while longer? Let's invest the time, the silver forts and the things like that to actually harden it. So I've been, right now the current active project that I'm working on for the rest of this year is on-prem AD hardening and that type of work. So I've definitely been dragged back into it. And I think there's also, going back to this whole dinosaur thing, I think there's also a little bit of like, we know that the attackers are well rehearsed and know how to attack this thing. We don't have all that very many defenders and folks configuring AD anymore, right? That have sort of been around since the beginning of it. So I think there's also a little bit of a gap there that's being taken advantage of. So
it's true. Parting comment from me before we close the show, because we're getting towards that time, is that there are very few folks like us who understand how to implement a modern security methodology like Zero Trust on top of Active Directory and understand where the native methods end and where we need to involve a third party so that we get some feature parity, at least, with the goodness that is Entra ID, where we get a lot of modern security, just transparent and built in, and machine learning models that look at risk weighting and that kind of thing. So
we almost got through an episode without mentioning AI.
I think it's going to be hard over the next few years. I'm not going to lie.
With that, it sounds like Darren, we need to have you back sometime to start to talk about PAWs and modern PAW architecture and stuff like that, because I think that could be a really, really fascinating topic. But for today, I think before we let you go, though, is there anything you want to plug or any? I know you're very active in the community with your blog, and you've got some really cool PowerShell modules and stuff that you maintain. Do you want to plug some of that stuff, and where can folks find you, see you, connect with you, things like that?
Yeah, sure. Look at my GitHub. Just look for Darren J. Robinson. There's actually a link up my blog, which is darrenjrobinson.com. And there's lots of, on the front page, my profile page on GitHub has a list of them all listed there. PowerShell gallery, there's a few that have got a couple million downloads and stuff like that. So probably not as active on the blog, but definitely still out and about in the community and happy to talk at events like this, and more than welcome to hit me up again in the future and come back and talk something a little bit different, but still IT security.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. Yeah, and you actually, just keep me honest here, but you have a PowerShell module for OnePass, right? So to be able to interact with
OnePassword, yep.
That's it, OnePassword. That's very cool. I remember that. So
you can programmatically retrieve credentials from your OnePassword vault and then use it for machine-to-machine authentication, which when they don't support machine-to-machine protocols. So this is going back to the LDAP and Kerberos thing, where you still need a username password and you don't have modern machine-to-machine protocols. You can still use your OnePassword to have a long, complex one, not hard-coded in any script.
That's stunning.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you for your time. This has only been a 2 time zone episode, which is great because we're on the same time zone, so that's awesome. But yeah, thank you for making yourself available late in the afternoon, and great having your company, Nick. Always good to see you too, and looking forward to catching up soon.
My pleasure. Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.